Violence, as William Petchers remarked, is the staple diet of the American film. Incorporated into a variety of filmic forms, violence has a bearing on most genres and historical periods. From the Great Train Robbery, in which violent conflict propels what is often identified as the first movie narrative, to Gangs New York, fashions in narrating violence have changed in accordance with the stylistic, technological, and cultural evolution of the medium. Most of the time, however, film violence is dismissed as mere exploitation. Despite the fact that, like eroticism, violence represents one of cinema's fundamental obsessions from the beginning, it is only on rare occasions that it warrants critical salutation. This quote from Gronstadt makes an interesting point of the spectacle of violence in mainstream cinema. For anyone familiar with Martin McDonagh's work, they will be well aware that violence is something he relishes, and indeed uses to great effect. Both his Oscar-winning short, Six Shooter, and his debut feature, In Bruges, do not shy away from gruesome and violent storylines. Even when considering his plays, most of which outdate his films, writer Maria Dial discusses how McDonagh's approach to theatre hinges on violence, violence recalled, violence threatened, violence narrated, and violence enacted. What McDonagh succeeds in doing extremely well is finding the fine balance between violence and humour, executing this technique with huge conviction. However, is perfecting the act of black comedy with stunning brutality really something that warrants critical salutation, or does it just succeed in using violence in an extremely entertaining manner?
I didn't hit one of them. That was fucking awful shooting. Fucking awful, like.
McDonagh's second feature, Seven Psychopaths, is certainly worth a mention in this regard. The plot, which revolves around a writer struggling to complete a screenplay, is self-reflexive in many ways, but what we will look at specifically is its use of violence. From the opening shot, it establishes its location in Hollywood, the birthplace of cinema, and also makes reference to an example of screen violence in the film The Godfather. This immediately sets up viewers' expectations with blatant references to violence and Hollywood cinema. The film also makes an outward point of playing with generic expectations of violence on screen.
Put your hands up. No.
What?
I said no.
Why not?
I don't want to.
But I've got a gun.
I don't care.
Doesn't make any sense.
This is particularly evident in the character of Billy Bickle, whose bloodlust on screen could be taken as a mirror image of the audience's expectations. A prime example of this is his desire to carry out violent acts in an attempt to motivate his friend to write a violent screenplay. While there are numerous examples of this throughout, for the sake of this essay we will focus on his fascination with the shootout. As one of the oldest tropes in cinema, Bickle sees it as a crucial element of the screenplay and goes so far as to script the shootout himself, as well as initiating the film's final shootout scene. These scenes are ridiculed both through comedic techniques and characters on screen, which in doing so raises the audience's awareness as to the repetitive nature of these violent tropes in mainstream cinema. So while McDonagh's plot and story is evidently driven by violence and violent acts, the self-reflexive nature of these acts does pose questions as to how violence functions in mainstream cinema. And while it may not qualify for the critical salutation that Gronstadt has mentioned earlier, it is at least asking the right questions of violence and generic expectations, making it his most ambitious work to date.